Hey guys, it's your professor here, Nathaniel Michelson. We're going to start off this chapter. I'm really excited for this semester, and I'm excited to be joining you with this journey. Since this is an online course, this will probably be a little bit self-paced. A lot of this will kind of fall on you to make sure you're on top of this, but I will make sure to have these chapter videos on Monday so that you have access to it, you know to review it, and this gives you some teaching instruction. If you need anything, don't hesitate to email me. Just want to get all that clear from the get-go. This is a fun course. It's an exciting course. It has its challenging moments, but it should be a fun ride. And like I said, you have access to me, access to the text, access to the online materials and videos along with this. And so with that, I want to get started with chapter 1. This will be a pretty quick chapter, just an introduction to the 10 principles that are kind of core foundational principles of econ. So you might be wondering, like, what is economics? And then inevitably, if I asked you, like, what do you think of, you'll probably say something like, supply and demand, money, um, politics. Like, these are things that kind of like come up, but they're not exactly what economics is. They're aspects of it. They're part of the discussion, but they aren't the core of it. In reality, economics is about how do households face the decisions they come in contact with daily. And what we mean by that is that, a household is you, your family, other families, myself, um, you and your parents, etc. Like these private units of society, like family members, then their decisions and their attempts to try to figure out, like, we face decisions on a daily basis, right? And so we're like, what are we going to eat for lunch? What are we going to have for dinner? What are we going to have for breakfast? How much should I be working this week? Should I take this job or that job? How should I spend my time? Should I relax, play some games, do some self-care, or should I be trying to get on top of this and get a head start on work? Because of that, that's why economics borrows from this Greek word economos, which means to manage a household. And that's the origin of the term economics, is because at the end of the day, we're interested in how these households are considering their options and decide to allocate their resources. And in a lot of ways, their ability to do that is based upon their own personal abilities, their own efforts and desires, and fundamentally right time. Like, you can only do so much with the time you have. Societies face these same decisions on a bigger scale because, right, like the US as a country is trying to figure out how to make decisions that make all the individual decisions of everyone in the country add up to something better for everyone. And a society determines which of their options it's going to allocate based upon which of the resource options they're going to allocate the resources to based upon how efficiently that will maximize output. And the idea here is that we are trying to maximize how much we produce, period. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about in a little bit. In order to try to maximize output as efficiently as possible, though, society has to consider scarce resources and the fact that we live in a scarcity limited nature. There's only so much gold in the world. There's only so much silicon in the world. There's only so much time in the world. There's only so much money in the world. There's only so many people in the world. These are real limitations on our ability to produce something. And so, in some degree, economists are interested in how households face the decision of scarcity or the finiteness of everything. So economists study how people make decisions and how they interact with one another in various markets. This decision making is at the heart of economics. And as I said, it can be as easy as when to work, what to save, how to spend. Decisions for businesses include whether to hire skilled or unskilled workers, how many people to hire, whether to buy this or that machine. This analysis overall can be broken down into a set of 10 economic principles that are broken down in further into 3 groups. 1, how people make decisions. 2, how people interact. And 3, an analysis of market influencers and trends that affect the economy as a whole. It's a bit jargony to go with, right? Like the first 2, you're like, this makes sense. And then the third one, what does this mean? And we'll get into that as the course goes on. So the 10 principles, really briefly, and we'll talk more about each of these in depth, is that people face trade-offs, i.e. there's no such thing as a free lunch. The cost of something is what you give up to get it, i.e. this is the opportunity cost. Rational people think at the margin. They think at the marginal changes. And this gets into something later we'll call the sunk cost fallacy. People respond to incentives, good and bad. Trade can make everyone better off. Note can, not will. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity, i.e., what to produce and when. Governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. Prices rise when the government prints too much money. And society faces a short-run trade-off between inflation and, for a dramatic effect, or maybe I just didn't make the PowerPoint slide correct, unemployment's that final word. So at the core of economics is a tension between efficiency versus equality. And efficiency means when society gets the maximum benefit from its scarce resources. And you can think of this as the pie. This is the argument that we want as large a pie as possible. And another way of thinking about efficiency, it simply means doing more with less. Equality, meanwhile, that refers to how equally and uniformly a society's prosperity is distributed across its members, how the pie is divided into individual slices. And I have a link here for you. You can look up this original paper, but this is originally explained by Arthur Okun. And fundamentally, the best way to think about it is that Republicans and Democrats at their best, emphatic is the emphasis here, are a disagreement of whether or not the pie should be larger, i.e. more efficiency, or whether the pie should be more equal. Now, the trade-off here is how does a household decide what to choose? They have to compare the cost of choices with the benefits to alternative choices. And this gets into something that we call opportunity cost. And that is what you give up to get something else. So, for example, a trade-off for this class is the time that you could be doing something else. And your decision to take this class is that whatever reason it is for you being enrolled in it, there's an idea that the benefit of this class for you and the benefit for what it gets you onward to is greater than the cost of the time spent in this class. And this is just kind of a general simple, but everything you do, there's a trade-off involved. If you eat one thing for lunch, that means you can't eat something else for lunch. Or it means you don't have the money because you went out for lunch to spend on something else. In order to make the best choice, we assume that buyers are rational. Now, I want to clarify something here. When we say buyers are rational and individuals are rational, we're not saying they always make the best decision. What rational means is that based upon what you think is true, you make the decision you think is best for you given that. That doesn't mean you're always right. It just means that you are kind of thinking in line with what you make a decision in line with what you think will be best. They're going to think at the margin and will only act if marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs. Now, this is kind of a silly example, but like, what do we mean when we say at margin? Really what we're talking about is the change by doing an action one more time, is it more beneficial or more costly? And I like to use the silly example, donuts, which is probably much more a reflection of my own problems. But I like donuts, I don't know you. But like, if you offer someone 20 donuts, are you going to eat all 20 donuts in one setting? I will probably eat 2, maybe 3. And let me explain. Because the first donut, no question, fantastic, tastes great, love it. Like, the fact that it's unhealthy for me means nothing. The second donut, still I'm like, oh yeah, the first donut was great. I'm going to have the second donut. Be fine, just 2 donuts. That's not too bad. By the third donut, though, I'd start being like, oh man, I've already had 2 donuts. These aren't good. Like, I mean, they taste fantastic, but I'm like, this isn't good for me. Should I have this third one? Should I not have this third one? A marginal thinker and the rational decision looks at just that third donut and goes, is this third additional donut, is my like health cost of having this donut lower than the benefit I will have of having another donut? So this is kind of a silly example, but like, it's one that's like practical. A macro example, because this is going to escalate quickly, is healthcare policy. One of the big debates right now is, should we have Medicare for all, i.e. should we have a public health insurance option for everyone, or should we have private insurance and accept that not everyone gets covered under this private insurance? And the discussion and argument here is that, is the benefits of having everyone covered by health insurance greater than the cost of eliminating a private insurance industry and the probably increased in payments that would come from that? That's a discussion. And so like, in trying to figure out whether or not a healthcare for all option or a ensuring and making more accessible private healthcare. This is one of the big debates: is which one is the cost and the benefits greater for? In line with this, people respond to incentives, and incentives can shift people into doing something sooner than they intended, or even something they never intended to. This guy, Nobel laureate Richard Thaler, he won the Nobel Prize in economics for his book Nudge. And basically, this little video explains the research that kind of goes behind this. And the idea is that you can kind of do like little subtle things that convince people to do things that you think are better for them than they otherwise would not. So, for example, in the Netherlands, you have to opt out of being an organ donor. And the reason why is that what people find is they default to the default. So like the only people that opt out of organ donors or opt into organ donors are people that have strong feelings about it. But if you make it the default, then someone has to have a strong feeling that they don't want to be an organ donor. And so these are little nudge tricks, and this is kind of forms of incentives designed. As another one, there's an incentive to come to college, right? Because by getting an education, you believe there's an opportunity that you might get better jobs in the future, and that is a part of an incentive for coming to college. As economists, we study interactions in markets. Markets are a good way to organize economic activity. Now, in general, what you need to understand is markets are not a physical thing. Markets are just an interaction between buyers and sellers as a whole for a certain product, for a certain industry. And a market economy is where markets largely govern how resources are allocated. And i.e., so this interaction between buyers and sellers is the prime determinant of what gets made and what doesn't get made. In some ways, right, eBay is a marketplace because you have a bunch of sellers and producers coming and offering stuff that buyers are then looking through trying to figure out. And you'll see that there's all these different prices because people are like, I just want to get rid of this, or someone's like, I think it's worth this, and like trying to negotiate and figure out. Markets will tend to efficiently allocate resources if left alone. This is Adam Smith's invisible hand theory, and it's really just this fascinating conclusion that people individually making these decisions tend to better determine the value of things in the real world as opposed to trying to state their value. And we recognize that the government can sometimes improve market outcomes. Enforcement of rules and property rights is one of the crucial ones. For example, think about how expensive cell phones are, right? So I have my cell phone here. Would you be as likely to buy an expensive cell phone if someone could just run up and you knew in 3 days someone could just run up, take and be like, this is mine now, and you had no recourse? Like you couldn't report it to the police, you couldn't say, hey, my phone, there's nothing I can do. The fact that government ensures that, and to be clear, this is not the case in all countries, but the fact in the US that property rights are largely enforced means that it's easier to interact with the economy and trust that when you buy something, this is now yours. This promotes efficiency and equality, and there's certain things governments do, and there's other things like avoiding market failure that governments do to protect economies. And for example, with the COVID situation right now, the government's been trying to do loans. They put interims on being kicked out of apartments. These are things that they've been trying to do to avoid a market collapse. The economy works as a whole so why do we do this? And the answer is the economy works as a whole to improve our standard of living, and that depends on our ability to produce goods and services. The reality is that the more a country produces, the more value it creates. This correlates to an elevation of the standard of living its citizens enjoy. Perfect case example, look at education. Almost always the richest countries enjoy much higher and better levels of publication. To do this, though, society will ultimately, it is kind of tricky because in a lot of ways over time there's a lot of questions now of, is this relationship that strong? And this is one of the big things being discussed today about the future of monetary policy, which we'll talk about that COVID's brought on us. But yeah, so this, everyone, is kind of the conclusion of the first chapter. This is a brief introduction. These are our 10 principles. As I said, I'm really looking forward to the semester. I hope these videos are helpful. And take care, all. We'll see you next time, which we'll talk about chapter 2, which is an introduction to models and thinking like an economist. All right, everyone. Take care, y'all.